Welcome to the next Smart QA musings on the perspectives on high performance QA. As always, this is a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. Hopefully, we should have an interesting set of perspectives on what it might take to do high performance QA in the next 25 odd minutes. So, before we jump on, just a quick definition. I think there is no end to how we can define what is high performance. And in the context of QA, what is high performance QA? This is one such definition, one such way of putting it, if you will. It's probably a path. High performance QA is probably more of a path to brilliant code. And the key notion of how can I do less yet accomplish more, right? And that truly is what is high performance, right? And what we're trying to do constantly is that being a path, it's a journey, it's a flow. So we're constantly trying to align in the path of brilliant code and just doing just enough to accomplish something really well. So we're not doing too much, we're not doing too less, we're just doing enough. Ideally, we want it to be the most optimal, which really is about the notion of less. So given this, what does it take to what might be perspectives, what might be things that we might want to do from the context of high performance QA. Here is some, I've kind of outlined this entire, in a way, the musings on 4 themes. And I've looked at it from, here are some 4 themes which are a little counterintuitive, if you will, and looked at how they might be beneficial to us doing high performance QA. So what are the themes? Number 1 is about the theme of language. Does really the act of the language, the structure, the medium, the way we write, the way we put, does it shape how we do things? Does it have an effect? And so the first theme is about how well we articulate, which is really about language styles that influence high performance QA. Theme number 1, which I will expound as after we cover all the 4 themes. We will talk about the different perspectives, which are 12 in number, spread across these 4 themes. The second kind of theme is on thinking. It is really about how clearly we think, and therefore what are the thinking styles that allow us to deliver or do high performance QA. Theme number 2. Theme number 3 is about, does really the order, the structure, the arrangement of the various elements of the problem, of the solution, of the test assets, and so on, do they matter? And therefore, we'll talk about how well we organize the styles of arrangement as the third theme, and then look at 3 specific perspectives in that area. And lastly, the act of doing, which is really about how well we execute the various styles of execution that might be meaningful for high performance QA. So how I'm structured the entire musings, if you will, and the presentation, if you will, is to look at it from these 4 themes of language, thinking, structure, and doing, and then outline, if you will, 3 perspectives in each of these areas, and then deliberate and share some ideas and opinions and views about them. That's how the structure is going to be. Being a webinar, if you have any comments, and more than anything as your views, comments, opinions, feel free to share it in the Q&A section as a chat message, which I think all of us can see. Okay. So that's really what we're going to talk about, the 4 themes and the corresponding perspective. So let's look at these 12 perspectives, which are kind of aligned along these 4 themes, and let's start with the first one. So what is one of the perspectives that I hold very dearly is the fact that, well, when it comes to language, there are many ways to look at it. One way is to look at, how do we express ourselves, right? And therefore, does language really shape the way we think? Is the writing style, does it have, does it shape our thinking? And therefore, my take on this is pay attention to the style of the language. You could have different styles of language if you go back and look any dictionary, so to speak. I mean, any grammar book, so to speak, or English book, so to speak, you will find there are styles which are descriptive, persuasive, narrative, and so on. You will find various sentence type, declarative sentences, imperative sentences, interrogative sentences, exclamatory sentences, and so on. So they're basically about writing styles and sentence types. And you might ask, why is that important? How does that matter? Are we not getting too much into the English or any language person, any language aspect for that matter? Not really, because at the end of the day, the way these sentences form in terms of styles and the language that we use shape our thinking in terms of how we understand, in terms of how we design, how we subsequently act, and how we even analyze. So the perspective one is, I think it's important to understand the role of expressive styles because they're powerful and because they shape the way we think. And therefore, language is not just some grammar or syntax, right? That's perspective number one. By the way, these 12 perspectives, I've condensed it into a 30-minute kind of a discussion session here, but I do have it also as a full-fledged, interesting ebook. I think it's about less than 50 pages, which I will share the link, which you can download. If you find, maybe you will find a little more detail, because certainly in 30 minutes, we will not do justice by going through all of them and confuse you totally, right? So I will share the book ID much later in this webcast. The second perspective is, okay, now that if you think that the styles and the sentences shape the understanding, what is next? It's about how we look at it from how do we communicate? How do we convert this into communication? Are we describing something? Are we prescribing something? Are we even writing it, or are we picturizing it visually? So how do we describe or prescribe or visualize? That is the act of taking the communication forward using the language styles is important because they broaden the cognitive capabilities. What does that mean? Sometimes we write full sentences, we write partial sentences, we write phrases, sometimes we doodle, sometimes we draw structured flow charts to understand something, sometimes we draw mind maps to understand sometimes we just doodle and understand sometimes we use words and connect words and make it look like word art. All these are the way by which we are communicating using the power of expressive styles, and that has a shape and that has a value, in understanding and extracting intent. And therefore, that's a second perspective on the language. So having said that, here is how we use the notion of styles. Here is how we express, our intent by broadening the ability to, think better. The last and stuff is, well, how do we convert this into what mediums do we use to express this? Is it digital? Is it let's say a free form document? Is it a much more structured spreadsheet? Is it a more deeply structured template? Or is it a free form, loose paper-like situation, digital or physical paper, where we can write whatever we want, whichever direction we want? So the idea here is the medium becomes important, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to use the low friction medium from an ideation perspective and structured templates for fully formed concepts. And therefore, on one side, we're storifying activities and possibly outcomes to communicate better and refine. Because at the end of the day, it is not always about few structures in terms of putting text in a particular order, in a particular format, in a particular stuff. The medium matters. When I say medium, you could say paper or digital, but I'm trying to go further down by saying, is it you need to have the ability to use a medium that does not curtail your thinking. And therefore, that's an aspect of the language which has a bearing on your thinking and therefore how you do, right? So there are three perspectives that I kind of outlined. One, the notion of styles and sentence, the ability to express in terms of describe or prescribe or visual, And finally, the idea of storifying, and therefore you need an ability to express it freely and easily. And all these elements shape how we use language to our advantage to deliver high performance in the way we think and therefore the way we do. If the second part is allied to that language, we're still continuing on the thinking stream. Now we're saying, okay, so what aspects of thinking, what perspectives on thinking might be of interest to us in this particular context, right? And that is where we are looking at saying, I think this we understand pretty much easily. One is to say, look, I want to be very left-brained. I want to be very logical, because at the end of the day, we are looking at examining behaviors by applying a sense of logic. There is an expectation of a certain logic that is to be implemented in the software, and we're trying to evaluate that. So why would I not use logical ways to do it? And that's where techniques come in. Now, when you say logical, how do you do? Do you look at inputs and then dissect, and then describe it in a very logical fashion and then use certain techniques from a forward direction? Or would I use the goal-focused thinking of saying, hey, this is what I want. This is the acceptance criteria I should meet, for example, and therefore derive what we should do logically, which is more of a backward style of doing things, which is yet logical. Or would I be approximate? We need to test for a large size data. We need to test for a rapid amount of rate of things to do. So we may not have precision. So do we think in terms of approximate styles? Do we look at it from a goal? Do we look at it from a user? Do we go from a forward, backward direction? Or do we do approximate styles of thinking? All these are one set of perspectives to look at it, which are in some sense logical. The other one is going completely visual, being very contextual, thinking from the users and social aspects. And therefore, this is more like right brain, more like creativity, right? And therefore, we are tending to be more visual, we are tending to be more contextual, we are more empathetic, and therefore connecting from a social aspect. And that's really the second form. So I think I'm sure we get that in terms of saying, hey, there is a left and there is right, and we need that beautiful combination of left and right to constantly be at it. Then the question is that all? Is that all it is in terms of thinking theme? Maybe not. Maybe there is a middle stuff. Maybe there is nothing in between. It's being very immersive. It's being very mindful, right? So it is neither left, it is neither right. It's somewhere in the middle. And therefore, what we're really saying is the act that I do, if I could develop, if I could be very mindful of any activity that I do, then I am completely immersed in that particular activity. And therefore, I can respond swiftly, create something in a very free form, unshackled by either the past or anxious about the future, because mindful by definition means you are right now in the present, right? And therefore, the themes of thinking aligned, with those perspectives of left or right or the middle, which is really mindful, probably have a significant shape, significant bearing to the thinking, and that is in some sense obviously governed by the language which we talked about. So these are some of the 6 perspectives that relate to, if you will, the right side of the picture, which was about language and thinking. And if we shift over to the other side, the left side of the picture, so to speak, the other half of the semicircle, is about the structure and the doing. So what do we mean by structure? The arrangement. Is it important to have order? Should there be a structure of your test assets? Should there be that's why I think most of us, from a process standpoint, we look and say, can you share me a template for a plan or a strategy or a test case or a report or, whatever, right? Because templates seem to give you a very structured, orderly way of doing things, right? And therefore, the structure deals with, is order important to delivering high performance? I'm sure you might have seen in the earlier days, I'm not sure if they exist now, if you go to any Japanese, auto dealer, scooter, car, and go inside their garage, which means, you go. Normally, I would deliver, let's say, I would go to the workshop to give my Honda scooter to, for example, service. And then I would normally see 5S. and then it'll say 5 is quality, and then it'll be a very interesting expansion. I don't remember offhand, but there are 5 Japanese words, and one of them will really focus on cleanliness of the workplace, arrangement of tools, and so on. It was part of the Japanese style of TQM. What they talked about is the fact that it is important to keep tools, if it's important to keep the tools in the right order, so you don't search, you don't lose it, you don't do stuff, and it improves efficiency, it improves effectiveness, because thirdly, it's also very aesthetic. So to me, structure has a very significant bearing. So what are structures? So one of the perspectives of the structure is, how do I arrange the solution elements? So when you say test cases, is there a structure? Do we say objective? Do we say in kind of bugs to look for? Do we say positive, negative? Do we say type? Do we say procedure? Do we say prerequisite? So is there some order of the various solution elements that form that particular test case, for example, to be in some order, so that there is a well-formed way by which I am able to put together, right? And therefore, how do I decompose the problem? Who, what, where, what, for, when could be one way of a structured approach to solve the problem, decompose the problem. And the other one could be in terms of the arrangement of problem elements, like the solution elements we talked about earlier, which is more like, say, how do I organize it across dimensions? I suspect that these two sentences may have been interspersed out, but basically one is an arrangement of the problem. So when you say problem, I think that's where the 4 Ws come in. Who wants to use it? What do they want to do? What is it they're expecting? Where do they want to do? Arrangement of solutions is basically like saying, I was giving an example of test case, for example, as to how do you order it? Do you say, hey, the test case is connected to an entity to test on that environment, which is positive and negative, looking for this kind of an issue, using this kind of a data. So is there a structure and an order that is there? So when we look at construction, when we look at the development, we normally use the idea of structure very deeply, because structure is very much part of the architectural notion of any product, right? So the way we arrange the various construction elements into maybe layers, into maybe how they are deployed, has a very significant bearing on the quote unquote the engineering quality or engineering design of a product. In a very similar sense, we're asking the same question in the context of testing. Is the arrangement of the various elements with respect to validation and qualification of a product, does it have a bearing on the performance of the QA that we do? And that's what we are talking about here in terms of the problem elements in the structure, solution elements in the structure, and finally appreciate the fact, looking at it primarily from test cases and saying, look, the key test elements which we all work with, the notion of scenarios, in whichever form you write, in whichever mediums you express, not necessarily all of it is going to be designed up front. You will discover a lot while you are validating a product. So to me, it is not sufficient to focus on the content of the test cases in terms of how many they are, how comprehensive they are. That is important, no doubt, because they have a sense. They have a very strong bearing to the adequacy. But in addition to the content of the test cases, the structure and the form of how the test cases are arranged, the scenarios are arranged, has a significant bearing for us to be able to judge the adequacy and certainly be more efficient, right? So I'm kind of very specifically put that 9th perspective on the role of structure, stating very clearly that the form and the structure of especially test cases significantly matter. In fact, I think I have a full-fledged webinar on the particular topic that I conducted many years ago. So in summary, all we are saying is it is not just sufficient for us to somehow do things, somehow follow processes, exploit all the tools. All those are essential ingredients, no doubt. But then the way things are internally structured and organized has a significant bearing, not from only the notion of discipline, but more importantly, it stimulates our thought to think on things quite differently, gives us newer and fresher perspectives, and probably allows us to go beyond what has the given the structure. So the innate notion of structure is important, right? So I think that is something that we fundamentally do in any discipline. So there is some way by which we organize a few things. So remember, organization in a process context would be considered as organization of activities across different people. There is a structure. But here we are talking about it from a practice perspective, from the individual's perspective of how certain fundamental elements are important to be organized for me to do a job with. And therefore, the last one is looking at it from the act of doing. We talked about language, we talked about thinking, we talked about structure, and now the last theme is primarily about the act of doing. And one of the things that we want to do is say, well, we all want to, as high-performing teams and people and work, we really want to maximize efficiency. And today, efficiency is probably a mantra, right? The question is, we all improve efficiencies by using technology, which is brilliant. And so we use tools, we use technology, we use intelligent tools, and so on. And we are trying to. But remember, a significant part of efficiency comes in by not doing work, by reducing unnecessary work, right? So efficiency is not about doing things far more faster and or being able to get it done by somebody else as in a tool or a delegated to some other technology. But it's equally important to focus on the fact that how are we enabling to doing less and accomplishing more? Are we preventing? Are we preempting? Are we understanding that the software has become immune to certain things, so there's no point wasting evaluating those parts, because those test cases are now not going to find any more bugs because the software is like become immune to them. That means it's rock solid in that area. So there's no point trying to do the same thing again and again, even if it is automated. And finally, of course, how can I intelligently regress? Meaning, how can I minimize what I do? But today, I think the extreme focus is always on adding capacity by adding more automation in the game, which is a great idea, but then has to be viewed in addition to other things that we should be doing. That is minimize work, right? We're not always about adding capacity. I mean, the interesting corollary in the context of our daily life, especially for people who live in big cities, certainly Bangalore for sure, and I'm sure that's true for most of the big cities in India and in certain parts of the world, is we always have traffics which is increasing. We always have more cars, more vehicles on the road, more people, especially in India, on top of it. So what does governments do? They add capacity. So we add more roads, we widen the roads, and of course, Bangalore, we are trying to figure out how to dig more tunnels and all kinds of interesting things, right? Elon Musk comes up with a boring company. So the question here is, all the governments are trying to do is to add capacity to solve the problem. Will that solve? Interestingly, if you look at certain interesting reports and how they've been applied in certain cities, especially in the urban cycling and urban some societies, you will find that people have resorted to reducing to improve the traffic. What do I mean by that? They've actually stopped building roads. They've actually favored more slow-moving traffic by making the road more conducive to cycling and walking, and reducing the amount of width of the road for cars and automobiles. And after about 15 years, they actually found the traffic to come down. They actually found it that they solved the traffic problem. Why? Because they reduced capacities. They reduced the want of a car. And that's probably an interesting corollary to the whole idea of doing less and accomplishing more, right? And whenever I look at these governments and what they're trying to do, I always wonder, will we ever solve some of these problems, right? The second one, we all want to leverage work. We all want to leverage work by reusing something, right? We want to reuse code. We want to reuse strategies and plans and test cases and so on. So what I wanted to kind of put us in as a perspective is to think about it as like, hey, all of us want to shift left. We want to leverage by doing things. So can we think of it from a smart checklist rather than a standard checklist? So what is a smart checklist? It is not telling you what to do. It is giving you ideas of what to do at an early stage. And that's a more higher form of leverage. And in fact, I did a full-fledged webinar many years ago on all that. And I was inspired by specifically a particular book, which if you have not read, would be a great read. It's called the Checklist Manifesto. It has got nothing to do with software. It's a book on checklists written by a doctor, and it has been applied in ICUs and hospitals, as healthcare businesses. It's applied in large construction, which is like building skyscrapers. It's also used in aviation. And you will find that the checklists have had a fantastic effect on their quality of work that they do. And when I say checklist, they just call it a normal checklist, but there's something more to that. That's something which I have prepended the word called smart. So the idea here is checklist is not like a mindless do kind of stuff. It's more about giving you ideas and helping you think so that you can think much early, do much early, and therefore prevent. And that's why I use the word smart checklist. And lastly, never forget the fact that from an act of doing, we might be more sensitive to doing less to accomplish more. We might possibly leverage some simpler notions of things like smarter checklist to doing early. And finally is the fact that the act of doing, how engaged we are, which is a very individual practice, being extremely mindful, doing things in very bursty, short sessions, and therefore being in a flow, like an immersive style of testing, which I call as immersive session testing, is something extremely powerful because it unlocks your inner potential. And that is the highest power that each one of us as individuals have, right? And that is the kind of the last perspective that I wanted to share with in the context of doing, to say, hey, we can do a lot of things by other things, but then the act of doing itself may be interesting to look at. And therefore, in conclusion, if I were to put all of them into one slide, and maybe it's a little dense, but just help you recollect some of these ideas and summarize here, that's what we're talking about. We're trying to say maybe high performance, in addition to all the wonderful things that we do, some of the counterintuitive ideas could be based on these 4 themes of how language shapes the way we think, the way we express, and the way we communicate, how thinking aspects are key, to harness our left side brain, which is logical, the right side brain, which is visual and approximate and creative, and of course, the middle brain, so to speak, which is immersive, which is mindful, which is highly contextual, right? And then going on to the idea of structure, where the arrangement, the order, how we put them together, order of problem elements. So when you are trying to understand something which are part of the problem, how do you understand? And that's when we talk about the who, where, when, etc. as a particular A. Similarly, when we say, I've got test assets, I've got plans and strategies and ideas and test cases and reports, the solution elements, is there a structure? Does the structural aspect matter? And finally, understanding that form and structure kind of matters as a perspective. And we finally closed it up with a bit of a doing, where we said, do less, do early, and be terribly mindful. And these are some of the 12 perspectives that I hold pretty dearly, and I try to practice as much as possible. And that's why I think it's come up as a bunch of musings. And I believe that it is something to do with something that hopefully helps me to constantly deliver higher performance. In this case, the act of queuing. So this is available as a book, and I will share with you the link anyway. I think Avani will share with you later. So this is available as a small ebook, which you can download from the website that's given up there, which I will share. And this is what it is. Okay. So if you would like to read and comment, I'd love to hear your comments and views now or later. And thank you for taking time off and listening to this interesting musings of today.